The following is a segment from the Carl King Podcast. If you enjoy this show, be sure to like, subscribe, and send us burritos. This week's listener question of the week is from Brave Sir John the Gentleman. Well, Brave Sir John the Gentleman sounds like a paladin. That is a paladin name, I'm pretty sure. Brave Sir John the Gentleman's question is, how do you mix orchestral and rock music together? Well, I'm happy to answer this from one night to another. I can't tell you which EQ and compression and plugins to use, so I'm going to instead explain why doing what you are wanting to do is so difficult and nearly impossible. The problem is that orchestral music and rock music exist in two vastly different ambient environments. A foundational element of orchestral music's style is that it is performed in a gigantic acoustic concert hall. By its nature, it is very wet. Reverberation levels are high in relation to the original instrument signal. If we think of musical styles on a spectrum, going from left to right, on the far left being in a very big ambient space, and the far right as being totally dry, rock music would be somewhere maybe 3/4 of the way to the right. And metal would be all the way to the extreme right, because metal music is very dry, lacking reverb, particularly the drums. Now, while there is reverb applied to certain instruments, overall it is highly transient and in your face. You really do not want the kick drum or chugging guitars to sound far away unless you're using it as a special effect. Now, if we look about 1/4 across the spectrum, way over to the left, there would be something like traditional jazz. And that's why traditional jazz music can blend well with an orchestra. The drums aren't expected to be up front in the mix, ripping your ears off. Jazz was a style developed before there was modern miking and recording and mixing techniques. All of that, let's put each instrument on its own channel and totally isolate it. Curiously, these styles developed in historical order along that reverb spectrum. There was tons of reverb a long time ago, and very little reverb today. Now, here's a cool thing. When listening to music that is at any point along the spectrum, your brain will adjust to the sound of that space. For instance, if you listen to a piece of classical music for a bit, you'll forget how wet it is, that it's in a big hall with all of the instruments bleeding together. But Pantera's vulgar display of power would sound awful in that environment. Try putting a 2-second reverb on Mouth for War and see what I mean. Imagine the sound of a metal band playing on the other side of an auditorium with no drum mics, and that's kind of what you'll hear. So basically, orchestral music sounds bad when it's dry, and metal music sounds bad when it's wet. So if you try to combine them, one or both of them is going to get seriously compromised. If you compress the heck out of orchestral music and squash it into a loudness maximized metal music mix, you will lose what was special about that big as heck orchestra. All the dynamics and subtleties and articulations and basically the art that we call orchestration. You'll end up with something that is orchestral-ish, but it's more like a thin keyboard layer. It might give the impression of being orchestral to a general rock audience or metal audience, but it's really not. And anyone that is attuned to classical music is going to hear how thin and lifeless it is. So what you are suggesting is very, very tricky, brave Sir John the Gentleman. Now, I have noticed you can add a few electronic instruments like theremin or synth or electric guitar to an orchestral piece in the way that Bernard Herrmann did. But once you add upfront heavy drums and try to make it a rock production, you are screwed. Either the drums are going to sound bad or the whole orchestra will sound bad. So if you're a rock musician or metal musician who wants orchestral sounds, save yourself the nightmare. Instead of hiring 30 or 50 or 80 people, just use samples. Otherwise, you will end up sounding like Yanni. Unless you like Yanni, then go for it. In my opinion, when popular bands get on stage with a full orchestra, it's mostly just a visual gimmick. But sometimes switching between the two ensembles can kind of work. But rock and especially metal music takes up way too many frequencies and is so heavily compressed that there's just no room left. I can't think of a single example where a metal band and an orchestra coexisted in a mix, with neither of them losing their own special strengths. If it has been done, I have not heard of it. But let me know. Leave a comment or send an email. show@carlkingdom.com. Anyway, I can think of some examples of smaller orchestral ensembles being successfully blended with a rock band, and here they are. Number 1, Lalle Larsson's 7 Deadly Pieces. This was a live concert he put on in Sweden in 2002. It's Lalle himself on piano, a basic 4-piece metal band, 4 orchestral percussionists, a string quartet, a trumpet, and a flute. And I count, I think, 15 players total. Now, that can totally work, and here's why. All of those instruments sound good in a drier rock mix. And it's far from being a 60-piece or 80-piece orchestra in a giant concert hall. Definitely go and watch Lalle Larsson's 7 Deadly Pieces. You can see the trailer for it or rent or buy the entire concert on Vimeo. And I will ask my team if we have the technology to add an HTML hyperlink in the show notes. Number 2 is Mats Morgan Live with Norrland Sopperen Symphony Orchestra in Sweden, of course. In 2018 or so, Morgan Ogren and Mats Oberg got together with a live orchestra to perform and record some of their music. And it worked. But here's why. It was a jazzy big band sound, which is only about 1/4 of the way across that reverb spectrum I mentioned. It's way over to the left, like a Lalo Schifrin film score. And you can see the entire concert for free on Morgan Ogren's YouTube channel. Again, we will see what we can do about some HTML programming. And the third example is the Aristocrats with Prima's Chamber Orchestra. In 2021 or 2022, the Aristocrats, a band made up of Brian Beller, Guthrie Govan, and Marco Miniman, collaborated with a group called the Prima's Chamber Orchestra, a group of strings from Poland, I think. And here's why that worked. It is a small string ensemble, 23 total players, according to Brian Beller, and the string players were fit into the context of a rock band. Now, if it had been a full orchestra with brass, percussion, woodwinds, not so much. But a smaller string ensemble can work well because it doesn't compromise the dry, close-mic'd rock band sound. As long as everyone is dynamic and mindful, strings are relatively easy to fit in. Go and check out the track called Stupid 7 on YouTube. And I'd like to thank brave Sir John the Gentleman for hand-delivering that scroll. I wish you the best on your paladin-like adventures against evil. If you enjoyed this segment from the Carl King Podcast, remember, you can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or through an old rubber hose.